So I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight. My name's Sue Richardson, and I've been given the challenging but also rather very enjoyable task of being MC for the occasion to celebrate the publication of Fran's book. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the land of the Kaurna people and say how much I respect their elders and their traditions and their care for country, and wish that we could do even a fraction as well as them in looking after this land. We've got a long way to go. But anyway, if you read the relevant chapter in Fran's book, you'll get lots of ideas about on that one. So I'm going to start by just saying a thing or two about Fran, because I've been given 10 minutes, and so I can tell you a lot about Fran in 10 minutes. The first, of course, is to note, as many of you, probably all of you know, that Fran is an extremely distinguished academic. Her official title is Matthew Flinders Distinguished Professor of Public Health and Director of the Southgate Institute of Health, Society and Equity at Flinders University. And after you've drunk a glass of wine, I want you to all repeat that. But what I really like about that is the Matthew Flinders bit, because both Fran and I are sailors and we're great admirers of Matthew Flinders, and we sail in waters that he first sailed in as the first white person to sail in those waters. Fran was also, in 2016, made an Officer of the Order of Australia for, and I can quote here, distinguished service to higher education as an academic and public health researcher, and as an advocate for improved access to community health care and to professional organisations. Now, that any one of those would have been enough for most people, but Fran's done it all. I'm not going to go through all her very distinguished career. I'll highlight the fact that she was a Federation Fellow in 2008, and for those of you with academic links will know the significance of that. But in addition, I think one of her very fine contributions has been as a commissioner on the World Health Organisation's Commission on the Social Determinants of Health. And this absolutely was a superb international, global forum for her to draw on her lifetime's work on the social determinants of health, which is an area which is certainly in health circles, doesn't have the status that being a skilled surgeon has, but in terms of promoting the health of nations and of peoples, it's far more important than hospitals, GPs, any form of doctor that you might like to know. If we could get the social determinants of health sorted, we wouldn't need nearly as much of all that patching up afterwards when the damage has been done. Now, Fran has said in her book, and I'm going to quote here because I want to refer to it, this is not to presumpt you, Ian, that this book continually poses the question of whether governance is for health and well-being or to promote the conditions to maximise private profit. It's written on the premise that public sectors are potentially powerful agents for health and well-being, and that capitalist economic systems are designed to maximise profit rather than health, and thus government regulation and controls are required to temper the quest for profits and to ensure the health and well-being of people and planet are protected. Now, I was reflecting on this and I wondered who might have an opinion on these propositions that Fran is going to explore, and I turned to Adam Smith. Some of you will know Adam Smith as both an extraordinary moral philosopher but also as the father of economics. I should confess at this point that I'm an economist.
We forgive you.
No, we should celebrate. So Adam Smith, and I found some rather nice quotes that I thought were rather pertinent to reflect on the purpose of Fran's book. The first one is, what can be added to the happiness of a man, he was of course writing in the 18th century, who is in health, out of debt, and has a clear conscience. So we don't need $1.2 million a year, was it you were saying? And he goes on, well, in a separate passage, all for ourselves and nothing for other people seems in every age of the world to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind. Vile maxim of the masters of mankind. So Adam Smith was writing in 1760s, 50s, 60s. But let me, and this is a further quote that Fran will love, and if she'd known about it, she might have put it in the book. Adam Smith says, a criminal, you'll like this, Richard, a criminal is a person with predatory instincts who has not sufficient capital to form a corporation. So this is the father of economics, right? But, he goes on to say, most government is by the rich, for the rich. Government comprises a large part of the organised injustice in any society, ancient or modern. And there lies the dilemma. If you believe that there's an element of truth in that, and if corporations are basically capitalised criminals, and government is by the rich and for the rich and a large part of the organised injustice in any society, then where do we turn? Well, I think, first of all, I think that that's perhaps a slightly, black and white view of government and even of corporations. But also, we can turn to civil society, and that's what Fran has done with extraordinary talent and energy. And I want to just tell you one or two things about Fran that you might not find on the Flinders website. The first one is that, and probably the most important, is that she's a devoted dog lover and grieving. So we need to be especially compassionate to Fran because her beloved dog died about 6 weeks ago. She's also, and this makes her, elevates her in most people's eyes, an enthusiastic and active sailor. And she's also, to those of us who are privileged enough to know and love her, a great friend. They're her personal qualities, but that are relevant to those who are close to her. But at a public level, she has a determination which is exhibited for her entire professional life to use her exceptional skills and energy to make our world and our country, we're lucky enough that she migrated to Australia, a fairer and healthier place. So she's not content to observe and record. She is an extraordinary activist, and the activism happens at the local level, it happens at the national level, and it happens at the international level. So she's not one to think global and act local. What Fran does is thinks and acts at global, national and local levels to very great effect. And one of the examples of this is her long and powerful engagement with the People's Health Movement, which is a global sort of civil society movement which is determined to elevate the health, particularly of the oppressed, to the top of the agendas of anyone who has power. So she's determined to work with civil society, academic institutions and health activists to work for equity, ecologically sustainable development and peace. These are the preconditions of having a healthy and long life for most people. I also know from observation that she's an extraordinary mentor and leader in her academic life and the teams that she's created and worked with over many years. And this book that she's written, and Ian of course is the one who's really going to tell you about the book, but the book is an ambitious, wide-ranging and seeks to inform and motivate the creation of a society or societies that's run on very different principles from the ones that we currently adopt, where good health is a symptom and a purpose for those societies. So we're very lucky to have not only Fran here, and I've got her book, so you can all, this is tangible. This is not just words. It's now, according to the running sheet, Fran's going to say something to us, and I think she's going to read from the book. Is that right?
I wasn't going to read from the book, but I'll point out a couple of the books, and I don't want to kind of take away Ian's team, but thanks, Sue. That's really lovely comments. And Sue and I are part of a group of women who we have dinner as often as we can, and I've
for 35 years.
For 30, we've been doing it for a long time, and there's Pamela and there's Margie from the group too, so that's fantastic to have friends here. But I'll say a bit more, but thank you very much for those comments. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Kaurna people and pay respect to the elders. And also I always like to acknowledge the resilience of the Kaurna people through the processes of colonisation, because I think it's remarkable that survived that process. And I really wrote this book because, increasingly when I get a lot of invitations to speak at conferences, and I just came to the conclusion that we really have created an environmental, economic and social mess in the world. It's and I think most of us would agree that we're heading down a path that really threatens, we say it threatens the planet. The planet will remain here. The question is, will this planet be there to sustain human life? And the Oxford University Press, who published a textbook I wrote, The New Public Health, were interested in a book that said what can be done about it. So this book is about, I try to write it as what are the solutions, what needs to be done in the sort of Leninist tradition of what is to be done, remember those tracks. So the main book's focus is indeed on that. How do we create sustainable, harmonious, equitable and healthy societies? And it looks at a whole range of sectors. It looks at urban and rural planning, housing, environment, education and local government, and even the fiscal sector. And I guess one of the things I feel very passionately about is the public sector. And it really disturbs me when people run down the public, because I think that the public sector is like the answer to our salvation. Okay, there can be problems with public bureaucracies, but as we heard Adam Smith say, and I love that quote, I'm giving an address in New Zealand in 10 days, and I'd love to borrow that quote, Sue. It sounds perfect when I'll be talking about corporations. And the other thing I've done in the book is stick my neck out, I guess, as an academic, and included a well-being manifesto for the years 2020 to 2015, which really says, look, I think this is what we need to do if we want to have the kind of society most of us would want to live in. But what I want to say is that books are never about an individual. We're always kind of garnishing ideas, and we're growing that, taking them in from lots of different places. And that is really the case with Governing for Health. It really draws on the 35 years that I've researched and taught and been an activist, particularly about this thing called social determinants of health, which really recognises the fact that when you look at what creates health, health services are important, but the most important thing are the kind of daily living conditions we're in, and then in turn the conditions that shape those. So probably just about everybody here in some way has shaped my thinking over the years, and I can't mention all of you, but I'm just going to mention a few to give you an idea of the sort of richness that feeds into the ideas that come out in this book. I've mentioned the Ruby's Dining Club that Sue's part of. I think that we've had so many great discussions there about the state of the world, and particularly from a feminist perspective, I think would be true to say. I have a group of friends in the West that we call the Wild Westerners, where we have dinner and we have similar conversations. And locally, there's friends from the Western Adelaide Coastal Residents Action Group, Jim and Anne and Paul and others here. And for me, that's very important, because often I'm working globally and then I come back down to the ground level and we find out the issues are actually the same. I've been in Bangladesh, you come home and people are facing coastal issues that they faced in Henley Beach. So that to me is really important. And then, of course, the People's Health Movement. I've been active in that for many years, and we just got a new local coordinator. Is Hayden still here? Hayden? Yes, Hayden's over there as our new, with the Raise, show your T-shirt, Raise the Rate T-shirt. And we were going to the People's Health Assembly in Bangladesh, and And Hayden was working for the Unemployed Workers Union then, and he agreed to be sponsored to come along to Bangladesh, almost on blind faith, and now he's become a new member of the People's Health Movement and taken on the job of being the Australian coordinator. So I'd just like to acknowledge that too. The other people who feed in is my family, and my sister Chris is here, my nephews Lloyd, Scott and Heath, and their partner, one of their partners, Scott's partner Maddie's there, and also my two little great nieces, to whom, amongst other of that generation in my family, the book is dedicated. So here's Maddie and Libby, and they've told them they can pick a book that they can take away with them, so they'll be doing that before we go. And a lot of people gave me comments on the book, but I'd particularly like to thank a colleague, Peter Sainsbury, who was also, as I was president of the National Public Health Association, and Peter was really good in providing great comments on the Urban Planning and Environment chapter, and also a colleague, Rob Hatton from the University of South Australia, who is an educator and progressive educator. And I did tweet the Wellness Manifesto, and I got some really useful comments from John Giardini and Melissa Raven, Melissa Sweet, who runs croaky.com, and Emma George. And I've also got a wonderful network of overseas people like Jenny Poppe, who you may know, Ron Labonte, David Sanders have been really important. And I have a real big debt to my colleagues. Put your hands up from the Southgate Institute. Yes, so we've created this little oasis at Flinders, I think, where we really focus on health and equity. And many of you may know that Flinders University has been going through a corporate nightmare. Leon and I have been comrades in arms, and Julian Merrick and Aidan as well, from a student and postgrad and early career researcher. We've been fighting a battle against the corporatisation of Flinders University, and it's been a battle that's injured many people, I think, and people have lost their jobs, people have have worked in that institution for 25 years and been treated really badly, and it really saddens me to have to say that about Flinders, because it used to be such an amazing place to work. The only good bit for me is that in the Southgate Institute, I feel like we've put up these barricades and we're there working away, trying to keep it. And so far, we've sort of managed to do that. And I owe a special thanks to Connie. Where's Connie Mussolino? Connie was my research assistant through this and was just brilliant. I'd say, "Oh, Connie, what can you find on?" And she'd go away and find me fantastic stuff. So I owe a great debt to Connie, and she organised all the permissions for the book, which if you've ever written a book, and she really helped me with the references. So thanks very much, Connie. So I'd really like to thank also Tony Delaney-Crowe, Matt Fisher, Toby Freeman, Tamara McKean, Colin McDougall, Julia Anath, Catherine Brown-Young, and Anna Zersh, all of my colleagues at the Southgate, all of whom are fantastic. And I also work, part of my research is working very closely with policymakers. And Carmel, if she's coming, is late. No, she's not here, but Carmel Williams has been a great inspiration to me, and I really like to thank her for teaching me about what policymakers do. And also lots of colleagues across the NGO world. Graham Brown is here as an example. I've worked very closely with people from NGOs and civil society, and they really put up with how we operate as academics, but teach us, well, what's it like in the grassroots? And that's really important to understanding what's important to people. And also, two associations have been really important to me as well. The Public Health Association, and Kate Kaminara is representing them as president here, and also the Health Promotion Association is really important. And in terms of NGOs, one of the biggest battles I ever fought against government bureaucracy was with the Christie's Beach Women's Shelter. And in that battle, we forged friendships, and Helen and Anthea are here. And again, we have dinners, and we've sort of been friends for many years as a result of that battle against bureaucracy. So thank you for that. So there's two other thanks I have to do. One is to Imprints, and thanks Imprints for hosting this event. And also, you all have been taking the time to wander around, but I think we're so lucky to have such a fantastic independent bookstore. So let's give them a clap for just running. And I noticed that you do online orders, so people don't need to order from Amazon, do they? They can order from you. If they can't get in here, they can order from you, so that's great. But my really deepest gratitude is to Paul Aras. He's my husband, my best friend, and he read and critiqued every chapter in that book. You know, he offered me every encouragement, and as I say in the book, the best in companionship and love while I was writing it. And he sort of gives me the confidence to do these things. I say to him, oh, this isn't any good, is it? And he really just tells me, yeah, well, sometimes you tell me, no, it's not quite good. And we're also partners in activism. Paul's taken over from Jim as president of WACRA, the local residents group, but he's also a bit active in global PHM. So we sort of do the global and local between us. And I know he wishes I spent a lot less time at my desk, and I'm going to try and do that, but as he knows, that's a struggle. So anyway, I hope the book I'd love to influence politicians with it, with policymakers to read it, and just ask that basic question, you know, who's benefiting from this policy? Is it about capital? Is it those, what do we call them, corporate crooks? One of my Indian friends always talk about those corporate cooks, and she's very sure about them. And, you know, or will this decision benefit transnational corporations and the super rich who increasingly are holding the world's wealth? We used to be much more equal than now. Oh, Abby, you all right? She's going to break the other arm, which she broke. Yeah, okay, there's something's come off it, yeah. You know, or are we going to plan, or are we going to have policies for the health of people? You know, in every sector, that's the question we should be asking, and I just don't think we are. And I think we have a powerful role as citizens to sort of be asking that question. Are we governing for health, or are we governing for profit? And I think we need a much broader constituency demanding that the people who do make decisions in our society try and make those decisions in favour of our health and well-being. And I'd just like to thank you all for coming. I said to Paul, maybe there won't be many people there. And as usual, he said to me, don't worry, yes there will, it'll be all right. And so I thank you all very much for coming. And each and every one of you has probably got in my head, and you've been reflected somewhere in the pages of that book. So thank you very much.
Another friend, but Ian Lowe is a remarkable man. We're very lucky that he spends 3 months of the year in South Australia or in Adelaide. The rest of the time he spends in Queensland or overseas, I think. He's a emeritus professor and he's a scientist, science, technology and society, and former head of the School of Science at Griffith University. Now there is sort of formal academic positions, but he's actually had an extremely distinguished career, both as a scientist and academic, but also as an advocate and another passionate person concerned about well-being much more broadly than just what income you've got. He was, like Fran, made an Officer of the Order of Australia, but in 2001, for his services to science, technology and the environment. And I'm very pleased that it's got the environment bit in it, because Fran's got a chapter on the environment. Ian Lowe is one of the most powerful advocates for nature, which doesn't have a voice in any other way, and it needs all the talent that it can get on its side. Ian was for 10 years president of the Australian Conservation Foundation, which I'm now very lucky to be councillor on, representing South Australia. He also received the Conrad Lorenz Gold Medal, which sounds extremely impressive, from the International Academy of Sciences, Health and Ecology. So he's got an extraordinarily distinguished background. He's got the passion in the right place. He's done very fine work. There's much of nature in Australia that we wouldn't have if Ian hadn't done the work that he's done and put the passion and effort and voluntary time into protecting it from the depredations of both humans and our economic activity in particular. He was, just as an aside, as one of his links to South Australia, he was also on the Expert Advisory Committee with the Nuclear Fuel Cycle Royal Commission. But I gather he's not a great fan of nuclear power.
was the token rat bag on the book.
I'm glad we had a token rat bag. I was also on the advisory committee and I put my hand up to be a rat bag too, but I think you gazump me. So at this point I'll ask Ian if he'll tell us what he thinks of the book.
Thank you very much, Sue. It's a real privilege to help to launch this book. I was interested to see you've dedicated it to your grandchildren and great nieces, because the last time I was in this bookshop was for Penny Wong to launch my book, which is dedicated to my granddaughter and all of her generation, because really what we're writing about is the future that they will inherit, for better or worse. And I think we have an obvious moral responsibility to try to hand the world on in at least as good a condition as we found it. And I suspect that if we were being judged by that criterion now, we wouldn't look too good. I'm going to tell you what I think of the book, but I want to warn you that I'm certainly not an objective observer, if such a thing exists. I remember talking to two followers of different football teams after a close match, and they disagreed about matters of fact, such as whether the ball was over the line, and matters of opinion, such as whether a free kick should have been awarded. They even disagreed about the visual acuity of the officials in charge and the marital status of their parents. So it reminded me that we all see the world through the lenses of our values and experience. So I'm giving you one take on the book. There'll be a short quiz at the end of the session to see how well you absorbed it. No, there won't. In fact, what I'm urging you to do is read it for yourself and form your own opinion. Now, this is shut down because I didn't do anything for 2 minutes. The main message, I think, and this was a sentence that really leapt out at me out of the introduction: a shift in governing is required if humans are to survive as a species. It's a pretty strong statement. You know, not a shift in governing is required if we're going to slow down climate change. Not a shift in governing is required if we're going to continue to have independent bookshops. Not a shift in governing is required if we're going to save the Coorong. A shift in governing is required if humans are to survive as a species. And that strong statement is backed up by the analysis in the book, which shows that basically, in ecological terms, we are in the Titanic heading towards the iceberg, and there are still morons literally and metaphorically throwing coal into the boilers, as if it were a goal of our species to get there faster. As the book says, the planet's ecosystems are under incredible stress, and as a result, there are numerous threats to our health and well-being. It's not all gloom and doom. There is some good news. Humans are now living longer on average than at any previous time in our existence as a species. And there are fewer people living in absolute poverty. And the extraordinary thing that's happened in our lifetime is literally hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty by economic development, particularly in some of the large and very poor countries like China and India. But the bad news, and that's also set out in excruciating detail in the book, is that the world is becoming less equitable, that life expectancies are now declining in some places, that resources are being used at an unprecedented rate, and that climate change is accelerating. And I was just reviewing the World Meteorological Organisation's report, State of the Climate 2018, which will be released tomorrow, and I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know if I tell you that it will say that the 20 warmest years ever have been in the last 22, the 4 warmest years ever have been the last 4, 2019 is predicted to be warmer still, sea level rise is accelerating, the massive loss of ice. A figure that really startled me: Greenland has lost 3,600 cubic kilometres of ice since 2002. 3,600 cubic kilometres. That means they're losing something like half a cubic kilometre a day of ice. And that, of course, all finishes up in the ocean, which is the main reason why sea level rise is accelerating. We've seen ferocious heat waves, dreadful fire seasons, Category 4 and 5 cyclones hitting Australia. And I'm old enough to remember when the late Professor Stark was vilified by the tourist industry for predicting that if the climate science was right, possibly by 2030 we might see Category 4 or even Category 5 cyclones hitting the Australian coast, because the strength of cyclones is proportional to sea surface temperature, and as the sea has warmed, cyclones have got more intense. I should add that even if climate change was not happening, we would still face serious environmental problems. And I was taken to task by a biologist 20 years ago for saying that climate change was a most serious problem. She pointed out that with goodwill and purpose, we could restore a pre-industrial climate in about 20 years. But extinction is permanent, and we are now losing species at a rate comparable with the 5 previous great extinction events in the history of the planet. And there is no way of recovering species once they're lost. Basically, we are pulling random bricks out of the wall of life in complete ignorance of when whole sections are likely to collapse. Because when a species goes, it has effects up and down the food chain, and we simply don't know what we're doing. So, as the book says, we need a shift to governing for health, equity and well-being rather than profit. And we've seen a significant takeover of what my partner calls the kleptocracy, rule by thieves, in recent years, even to the point where one of their number seems to be in the White House. The book identifies a whole range of actions to maximise the chances of citizens leading long, healthy, productive and happy lives. And in a sense it reminded me that the first report of the Club of Rome, The Limits to Growth, published in 1972, was vilified because it said that if the growth trends continued, we would reach limits to growth within 100 years, and the most likely result would be collapses of systems in the middle decades of this century. Its second conclusion was that none of those trends was inevitable, and that it would be entirely possible to redirect the trajectory of human development onto a path that would be sustainable into the distant future and would allow every human, however carelessly they chose their parents, to live happy and productive lives. And it said that if we wanted to achieve that sustainable future, the sooner we started, the better. Well, we've lost nearly 50 years of inaction, largely because of the neoliberal ideology, the convenient fiction that if we only trusted the market, good things would happen. And as Tom Lehrer famously said in the 1970s, if you trust the market, the rich get rich and the poor get children. Indeed, Adam Smith said something very similar. He didn't put it quite as tactfully as that, but he pointed out in The Wealth of Nations, printed in the 18th century, that leaving things to the market will inevitably result in inequality, concentrations of wealth and power, which we know from all our experience will be abused. The problem is, as Fran says in the book, that governments too often opt for policies that will ensure profit for some, expecting economic growth will bring benefits for the entire population. But in a lovely sentence that sums up what's happened, she says, wealth has not trickled down to the many, rather it has floated up to the few. And that's what's happened in the last few decades. Andrew Lee's book, Battlers and Billionaires, documents the changes in Australia since the 1960s, when we were probably the most equal society that has existed, at least since colonialists disrupted pre-industrial societies. We are now the third most unequal in the entire OECD as a direct result of applying the neoliberal economic ideology. Fran points out that Credit Suisse said in 2017 that the 42 richest men, and I use the gender-specific word advisedly, the 42 richest men in the world have as much wealth as the poorest 3.7 million. Billion, sorry, 3.7 billion. In other words, about half the human population together have as much wealth as the 42 richest kleptocrats have managed to accumulate. And the trend is getting worse. Oxfam found that the incomes of the poorest 10% of the world grew by less than $3 a day between 1988 and 2011, while the incomes of the richest 1% multiplied by a factor of 182 in the same period. The rich get rich and the poor get children. We see inequality reflected in things like life expectancy. As Fran points out, the average life expectancy in affluent countries like Australia is in the 80s. In poor African countries, it's about 50. And it should be a feature of national shame that it's still true that the average life expectancy of our Indigenous brothers and sisters is on average 10 years less than those of us who chose our parents more carefully. Public policy is vital, Fran says in the book, because it establishes the framework within which we make choices. I remember being on the Consumers Association Council 30 years ago, arguing for food labelling so people could make more intelligent choices. And the junk food industry have resisted that every step of the way, so that 30 years later we still do not have food labelling that helps people to make intelligent choices, because those who profit from people making bad choices have successfully resisted it. Similarly, the tobacco industry fought for decades successfully after the science showed the disastrous impact of smoking tobacco, and for decades successfully prevented any action to control tobacco. People can only use public transport if it's available and safe and affordable. So we tell people, save the planet, go by train or tram, but they find that the train or tram is not available or it's not safe when they want to go on it. We've backed away from planning. Planning has become almost a dirty word because it's interfering in the market. So we've given up on urban planning and we've allowed the creation of meta-suburbs in the urban fringe that have no decent public transport, no prospect of decent public transport, no facilities within walking distance, which condemns people to drive for hours on congested roads to get to services which are not within reach. Newman and Kenworthy did a comparison of two new cities that were established in the 1970s, one in the Netherlands and one in the UK. I had the misfortune to live for 5 years in the one in the UK when I was working for their Open University. The interesting feature was that the UK new city had about half the number of dwellings per hectare as the Dutch new city. As a consequence of that, in the Dutch new city, 26% of journeys were made by bicycle. In the British city, it was 5%. In the Dutch city, 20% of journeys were made by car. In the UK city, it was 60%. If you structure your cities so that the services that people use every day are within walking or cycling distance, people will walk or cycle. If you perversely ensure that nothing that they need to access is within walking distance, people will drive. And you will then say, oh, the roads are congested, we need wider roads. And at the moment, your government and the Commonwealth government are spending squillions turning South Road into the north-south motorway, seemingly in ignorance of the fact that no city in the world has ever solved its transport problem by building more roads. Building more roads simply encourages more people to drive, which means the roads come congested, so you need to build more roads. You get to the extreme of Los Angeles, where 50% of the downtown area is given over to the car, and still there is gridlock every morning and every afternoon. Yet we are still, as if resources were unlimited and climate change was not an issue, still tipping squillions into dinosaur road schemes instead of giving our cities decent public transport. As well as the individual bits of public policy, I think we also need to recognise that underpinning all of those problems is what my partner calls the toxic meme of growth. The continuing delusion you can have unlimited growth in a closed system. And so the destruction of habitat, the destruction of communities is justified if the economy grows. And I have never got a satisfactory answer from any of them as to what point will we reach when the economy has grown enough to satisfy the most outrageous and grandiose demands, and we can stop growing and live equitably. So if we're going to make rational decisions, as Fran's book points out, we need better indicators of progress than the gross domestic product, which is simply the sum of all economic activities. If there is more crime, the gross domestic product increases. If there is more violence, more disease, more natural disasters, the gross domestic product goes up. And it's insane to suggest that if only it will become sufficiently gross, that all our needs will be satisfied. Secondly, we need a goal of reducing inequality and inequity. And Fran reproduces in her book, if I can find it, a lovely diagram from the book by Piketty and Wilkinson showing the relationship between inequality and poor health. And basically it's almost a linear correlation, that above an income of about $5,000 per year, there was no relationship at all between average income and health outcomes, but there's a very close relationship between inequality and health outcomes. So that at the top at that corner is the United States of America, which has the highest per capita income of any OECD country and the worst health outcome, because it is by some measure the most unequal society. And finally, Sue reminded me that Adam Smith said, and Fran takes up this point in the book without citing Adam Smith, although he could be wheeled in on your side, that if you allow public ownership of an essential service, you will inevitably see price gouging, you will inevitably see the community ripped off. So those who thought it was a good idea to sell airports, to sell ports, to sell essential services were basically lining the pockets of corporate thieves at the expense of the community. As Fran says, education is critical. It's an obvious determinant of health. I was recently reading your government's health and wellbeing strategy, and there's a chart in there identifying 8 chronic diseases that are all increasing. In 7 of the 8 cases, there is hard evidence that the risk of having that disease is closely related to your socio-economic status. Lower socio-economic status, the more likely you are to have the disease. The only exception is one for which no data is available. So where data is available, it shows in every case that the risk of having a chronic disease increases with lower economic status. Education is also the key to equitable distribution of benefits. So if we want a healthier society, we need a better educated society. I've argued for decades that education is the best possible investment in our future, and you see around the world countries with almost no natural resources that are prosperous and happy because they invest in the education of their community. We also need urban planning for healthier and more ecologically sustainable cities. More broadly, I think it's clear that ecological integrity is now an urgent priority, and I've lost count of the number of reports that have been telling us for the last 30 years about the increasing environmental problems of an ever-expanding global resource-dominated economy. The 5 unit reports on the global environmental outlook, the reports on the ecological footprint, the Living Planet reports, the World Scientist Warning to Humanity, the Stockholm Environment Institute study of planetary limits, all have been sounding warnings that we risk destroying the life support systems unless we become more aware of the impacts on them of human activity. So the book ends with positive examples of good governance for health and 6 key lessons which I'll read out to you. The first is reducing inequity. The central vital mechanism for building population health is reducing inequality. Second key lesson is to recognise that human health is intimately connected to planetary health. The delusion that we are healthier if we are more affluent assumes that the market gives us everything we need. But the market doesn't give us breathable air. The market doesn't give us drinkable water. The market doesn't guarantee the capacity to produce our food. The market doesn't give us the identity that we get from our natural surroundings. It doesn't give us the spiritual sustenance we get from enjoying natural areas. The ecological systems are absolutely critical to our health and well-being, and we are no more divorced from the integrity of natural systems than gum trees or galahs or goannas or garfish. Like them, we depend on natural systems for our sustenance. We depend on natural systems to process our wastes. Third conclusion is how we govern is vitally important to how healthy, sustainable and equitable we are. Policy decisions being made every day make our society either more or less equitable, more or less sustainable, more or less healthy. Regulation, Fran says, is a powerful and essential tool of governing for health, An important point, because regulation has been demonised by the neoliberal ideology, which has presumed that governments don't know enough to regulate. Regulating is inevitably interfering in the market, which we all know is inevitably the most efficient means of allocating resources. So government should step back and allow the market to operate. I like the point that Richard Dennis makes, that when government says the market thinks this, what they're actually saying is my rich mates think this. And it's the collective wishes of their rich mates that is manifested as the market. Fifth point, new ways of measuring progress are important. The gross domestic product was invented in the 1930s. It was a temporary measure. It is certainly well past its use-by date. We need better indicators of progress. Fran and I are both members of a group called the Wakefield Futures Group that had a small amount of funding from the previous government to calculate the so-called genuine progress indicator for South Australia. The genuine progress indicator subtracts from the gross domestic product those expenditures which are negative. So it subtracts the cost of violence and crime, it subtracts the cost of disease, subtracts the cost of catastrophes. And if you compare South Australia with the rest of Australia on a genuine progress indicator, life in South Australia has got steadily better and life in the rest of Australia has not. And one of the reasons is that South Australia hasn't had as rapid a rate of population growth as Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane and Perth, which are now facing appalling problems of congestion and social upheaval as a result of rapid population growth. I noticed in today's Advertiser there are some politicians of limited grasp of these sorts of issues who are lamenting the fact that Adelaide isn't growing fast enough and dearly want you to have the problems that Brisbane and Perth have as a legacy to their leadership. And the last point that Fran makes is the importance of leadership for health, equity and well-being. The most common complaint I hear about governments at all levels is the lack of leadership. The cultivation of what could be called followship, deciding what they will do by consulting focus groups or sophisticated polling and working out what will do least damage in marginal electorates that they want to retain, rather than thinking about what sort of future we want for Australia, what sort of policies will take us in that direction. That should not be contentious. I remind people that in 1992, more than 25 years ago, COAG, the Council of Australian Governments, sitting in simulated majesty in Canberra, adopted the National Strategy for Ecologically Sustainable Development. And if you read that national strategy, which in principle the Commonwealth and all state and territory governments signed up to, we are committed to, and I quote, a path of economic development that safeguards the welfare of future generations, to improving, quote, equity within and between generations, end of quote, protecting our unique biodiversity, and maintaining the integrity of ecological processes and life support systems. Now, I think it would take a very generous assessor to detect any sign that recent governments, Commonwealth and state, even know about the National Strategy for Ecologically Sustainable Development, let alone see that as the framework within which we should be making decisions. But Fran's book, I think, is a rallying call to re-establish that sort of framework, to make economic decisions that safeguard the welfare of future generations, to strive for equity within and between generations, to protect our unique biodiversity and maintain the integrity of ecological processes and life support systems. It's also a reminder, as used to be said by the Commission for the Future 30 years ago when we had a Minister for Science who thought we should think about the future rather than trusting it to the market, that the future is not somewhere we're going, but something we are creating. At any given time, there is a wide range of possible futures, and which one materialises will be the product of our decisions and actions as individuals, members of families, members of communities, members of organisations. If I could pursue the sailing metaphor, you can't choose which wind will blow, but you can set the sail. And if you think about it, a canny sailor can use whatever wind is blowing to sail wherever they want to go. If you don't know where you're going, any road will do. But if you do know where you're going, you can make conscious decisions to head in that direction. We can't control the winds of global organisations and international finance, but we should be setting the sail to point us in the direction that we want to go as a community. So I urge you to read this book. If you know a politician who can read, urge them to read it. Use it to influence the political debate. As we choose our politicians, we choose our government, and we choose our future. So have this book on your desk, have it in your shoulder holster, use it like the club of the righteous to advance the debate, because as Fran's book reminds us, the decisions we make today, tomorrow, this week are determining the sort of Australia that these young people will grow up in. And we have a responsibility to do better for them than we have in recent decades. Thank you very much.
During this period, the United States has gone from ranking 16th to ranking 34. So we could do a lot worse. Now, just before we crack that bottle of very fine Australian white sparkling across the bows of this book, I want to leave you with one thought, and that is, when the people lead, the leaders will follow. So, if I might be presumed to encourage you to think health equity, think climate change, think environment when you're voting at the next election. Well done, folks.
So thanks, Sue. Just like to thank Sue for chairing. Thanks, and that's it. And buy books from Imprints. There's lots here.